Well, I think now, I think we could start. We're going to remember the dynamic for those who were not with us in the encounter we had before. First, Antonio will tell us a little bit about his experience interviewing the women who had the miracles attributed to John Paul II, and then Mother Adela will tell us about her experience bringing the relic of John Paul to the entire American continent. If you have any questions during the encounter, we'll have the chat activated and we'll respond. So if it sounds good for you, we're going to connect now before beginning with the Rome Report's editorial staff so he can tell us what's new in the Vatican. So if the director's here, Javier, he'll tell us a little bit about how things are going over there. Hola, hello, Adriana, he says. The truth is that I asked Adriana for a space to be able to greet her with the excuse of being able to give today's news. Well, today we're just closing the video news of how the Basilica of St. Peter's being prepared to open on Monday. Technically, the Vatican explained to us is that it was never closed. It has remained open, although we couldn't go in ever since the lockdown began in Rome. We've also been seeing a beautiful letter that Benedict XVI wrote to John Paul II, and also the message of Pope Francis about the internally displaced. That's very interesting and very, very good. And it's been a pretty calm day, but with also some surprises, and it's not over yet. Look forward to listening to the sister. Javier, if we're in the meeting and you find out any news, you tell us, huh? So we can receive the first fruits of it. Well, Antonio, begin whenever you'd like. Very good. Very good afternoon to all. As Adriana said, I am Antonio Olivier, the CEO of Rome Reports. And above all, a few months ago, we began to work on a project that is about the miracles of St. John Paul II. It's a very pertinent theme because he's alive, and the title of the documentary that we're preparing is along that line. John Paul II is alive. Why? Because there's so many extraordinary facts and acts, things that have happened, that now Mother Adela, that's why she's here, she'll tell us a little bit about that. They're acts certified by the Church, facts certified by the Church. Before we greet Mother Adela and move to her part, we want to greet many people connected here through the means of communication. The Spanish ambassador to the Holy See, good afternoon. And different people responsible for different religious institutions are here. Good afternoon. It would take so long to greet everyone. But basically, as Adriana was explaining, this segment is going to be 45 minutes long. Mother will speak about 20 minutes. And then from then on, we'll go to questions and answers. So this project, as I told you about John Paul II, John Paul II is alive. And really, the release of the documentary would have been today. But because there's a virus that hasn't allowed us to work at the same rhythm, the release will come a little later, but the work's advancing. But the point of departure has been from 3 essential encounters. Antonio is reminding everyone to mute their microphones because they'll pick up all the other noise. So, the first encounter was with Monsignor Oder, who was the postulator for the cause of canonization for St. John Paul II. And he has told us, and this has been really revealing for me, that he still is receiving letters and emails from people who say that they've had these extraordinary acts happen to them through the intercession of St. John Paul II. And he has told us, I was just with him a little while ago, that he has received 10,000 emails from people who say they've received a special grace or a special miracle, and 5,000 letters, written letters, like they used to send before, because this process has been about 15 years. We have spoken with him, and I personally had the blessing to go to Costa Rica to meet the woman named Floribeth Mora, who received the miracle that brought John Paul to canonization. It was a miracle investigated by the doctors of Costa Rica and the Vatican. And then the other miracle was with a French religious, and this was for the beatification of John Paul II, this miracle that healed her. The encounter with Monsignor Oder was very interesting because of these 10,000 emails that he received and 5,000 letters, 15,000 in total about these extraordinary events. He had to make a selection, and he told us that that's where the two miracles testified to came out from. As you know, the Church, to be able to certify someone's holiness, the Church needs a miracle for the beatification, besides many other things that are the fame of sanctity. As you see, the fame of sanctity in the case of St. John Paul II, you didn't have to investigate it much because it was very clear from almost the first day. But later, other requirements. There's a pretty long process that has to happen. Within that process, there's a medical process. And the medical process, local doctors intervene that aren't even Catholic sometimes, and simply they come to testify to the facts that scientifically that have happened, and that scientifically it's not possible. So in the case, Monsignor Oder, who's Polish, he works in the Vicariate of Rome, in the Lateran Palace, where the Church of St. John Lateran is. Maybe many people don't know that it's the see of the Pope. It's the Cathedral of Rome. It continues to be, to this day, St. John Lateran. That's where the palace is. So he works there, and the entire Vicariate of Rome works there. In the case of Monsignor Oder, he says that many of the miracles that have happened are related to the family, and this coincides with what, and with a little bit of what has been the life of St. John Paul II. And later, there were many miracles related to other themes related to John Paul II, the fight for freedom, the fight to give a voice to the people, well, to people who had been bombed, people that are suffering from some kind of restriction, and in this case, also in reference to religious freedom and to other miracles. Family and freedom are a few of these themes, and now we're going to speak about some of them. In the first case, coming from the interview that we had just done in France with this religious, we have received the help of someone very important. That's probably a colleague responsible of communication in the Holy See, and he is French, and he has been for many years responsible for the communication from Lourdes, and he had contact with the religious and the religious of the order of Sister Simone Pierre. She is a religious that in the year 2005 she had Parkinson's, and now from then on she didn't have it, but she started, from what the doctors say, it's a process that doesn't have a cure. You can slow it, but you can't cure it normally. So she had already come to such a level that it was hard, from what she told us, that she couldn't even see images of St. John Paul II because she saw in him reflected how she was going to be in 40 years. And she was still very young in that time, and she already saw herself paralyzed, and she was working in a pediatric hospital, and she was responsible for attending to families and to mothers, and she had stopped working. She couldn't even work. And so for people, she couldn't even stand on her own. She said she had to be supported by a wall. So she couldn't even see these images of John Paul, and this is going to come out in the documentary. And you can see images of her practically running. She had spent 15 years practically from this death of St. John Paul II. Well, when she stopped working, she had to stop. She has come back, and just 2 months ago we were with her and we followed her with the camera, and it's incredible. So the situation of this religious, they investigated it. The doctors there investigated it, and the doctors of the Vatican, there was no explanation. No explanation. So it's not understood. This miracle is attributed to St. John Paul II, and it's beautiful because time, what has happened after this, and this documentary shows, is not just a miracle of the past, but it continues being a living miracle. He's alive. Now, the second person that we have had the blessing to be able to go, and we went at the end of February to go there, and if you haven't been to that country, it's a marvelous place with a sensational climate, and the capital is more or less a little high, because so it's a little bit cool, and at night it's almost cold. Well, that's where this woman is, Floribeth Mora, and she had a cerebral aneurysm, and she, just from seeing the images of the beatification of St. John Paul II, a few days before, they had diagnosed her, and the doctors had said, look, your case has no solution, and we're not going to treat you in the hospital, so go home, because there's nothing to be able to do. You probably just have a few days. It could be a few days, it could be a month and a half. She had such strong headaches. They did all kinds of scans and tests in the hospital. And we've not only been with her, but also in the 2 hospitals in which she was, and we've spoken with the doctors. And well, the incredible thing is that she couldn't even move in the bed because of the strong pains that she had in her head, and she had a part of her body paralyzed. And then the doctors, in this case, I have seen, this was the year 2011, if I'm not wrong, because that's the beatification of St. John Paul II happened in that year. When we saw her 9 years later, 9 years from the day that they said, you're not going to live, go home, now we see her strong. To meet her, she invited us. I went with a camera, and I had the blessing. I was with her. I spent a few hours with her. It coincided with the time to eat, and she was just running circles around all the nieces and nephews, perfectly active, working all day. And the incredible thing in her case is that in her moment, 9 years ago, no one would have believed this, and she's perfect now. And it's beautiful. We just heard a piece of news yesterday. Hasn't been seen on Rome Reports yet, but it's about how these 2 women of the miracles of St. John Paul II are going to celebrate today his centenary on Monday. Well, basically, these are maybe the most proved miracles, but there's many others that I have said that in the church has not had to do investigations into them, because once a person's in the process of beatification and canonization and those miracles are confirmed, you don't have to do anything else. The Vatican couldn't continue to prove all of them. They would have had to have a whole department to prove all of them. But these are two physical miracles. But Mother Adela now is going to be able to tell us that there's many inexplainable miracles that are much more spiritual, or people that, being drug addicts, people of the mafia, delinquents, people that have had a radical change of life without any rational explanation, other than somebody asking for St. John Paul II's intercession. And in the documentary that we speak about that, and in other cases too. And also with the religious of the Order of Mother Adela, that tells us a little bit about the process of the relics. We're speaking about one of the important people, just to finish, and it's Thomas White. Thomas White is a person that maybe you don't know, but today he's a professor of one of the universities, pontifical universities of the Angelicum in Rome, and who was an atheist, and he converted in an American university. And what moved him to convert was reading St. John Paul II. Today he's professor of, if I remember well, on the unity of St. Thomas and fundamental theology or metaphysics. I don't remember exactly, but he's an authority in Rome, a phenomenal person, young. And we have also spoken with him and with other Americans that have converted. The number of people whose life has been changed because of World Youth Day is something very incredible. So we have invited today Mother Adela Galindo. As you know, she is the foundress of the Servants of the Purest Hearts of Jesus and Mary. And what does this order have? It's a new order. It's a charism very united to St. John Paul II. And above all, what they have done during years, taking the relic of St. John Paul II through various cities of America, and they have seen, well, it's a phenomenon. And that's why this has caused pilgrimages, and it has moved so many people. And part of what will be told in this documentary, and that maybe sometimes we forget, and when I say St. John Paul II is alive, I think Mother Adela can explain it very well to us and can give us a very good explanation of what has happened from simply just a few drops of the blood of St. John Paul II, what it's provoking. So I also wanted to greet the ambassador from Panama to the Holy See who's here with us. Miroslava, very good afternoon. And nothing else. Let's pass over to Mother Adela, who's going to tell us a little bit about what is happening. And also a little bit about the event that they were going to have on Monday that they had to push back, that Monsignor Order was supposed to be part of. So she's going to tell us about this phenomenon and how it's been. Mother Adela Galindo. Thank you, Antonio, for this opportunity. Truly, first I would like to thank you for the title that you're giving to this program and all that you're doing in reference to the centenary, is that St. John Paul II is alive. And in my experience, I can say, in all that we've lived as custodians of the relic, the pilgrim relic of the blood of John Paul to the American continent, I would like to refer to something that happened that I was present for. And I think I had the privilege to be present for almost everything that John Paul would do in life, not only in private masses, but in all of his visits, I tried to be present. And I remember his last visit to the American continent for the canonization of Saint Juan Diego. And we were there in the airport when he was going up into the plane. He could almost barely walk. He was on an electric escalator. And he turned his face and he looked at all the people. And he said, "I go, but I do not go. I go, but I stay because my heart stays." And that phrase touched my heart so much, because we all knew that his end was drawing near. His physical presence here on earth was drawing near, the end of that presence. For me, it was a surety to know that he was giving us that promise, that he would be with us. He would be alive in the midst of us, in the heart of the church. And precisely, I think that phrase developed many things that happened with the relic. It was a privilege to be in charge of taking care of the relic and pilgrimaging with it with a team of sisters and brothers through the entire American continent. We made 4 pilgrimages, and logically, Monsignor Oder, we have a deep relationship with him because he entrusted this mission to us. I would need that he would give it to me many times for years because we wanted to journey all through the Americas to all the places that John Paul went to in life, to not leave a single place that he journeyed to not leave a single experience that he lived, so that he could continue walking through the American continent in this unique way. Monsignor Oder says that the letters continue to come, and we're a part of that, because every time that we do a pilgrimage, and we had a whole year's pilgrimage for the year of the centenary of Fatima, one sister is dedicated exclusively to collecting testimony, making videos and audios, and that's all collected and given to Monsignor Oder when the pilgrimage ends, when we return the relic to Rome. What have we seen? I think that the first miracle that moves me so much, the first miracle is how it's announced. The first contact that we do is, besides the permission of the ordinary of the place, the organization of all the masses that are going to receive the relic, the masses that are going to take place to venerate the relic, they're the secular means of communication. And I say that the relic of John Paul's liquid blood is coming. Now we can't forget that we're speaking about that John Paul's alive, that the relic itself is a miracle, and that the blood is liquid. And that's the first thing people ask. What treatment has it received to keep it liquid? Well, in his last days of life, when they were taking blood from him to do tests, every person that has a blood test, they put a liquid into it so that it can have a sufficient amount of time to keep it liquid for the amount of time of the test. But immediately afterwards, it coagulates. The sisters, the sister at the end, the feminine genius, had the detail to be able to save those vials of blood, but not because they thought it was going to be miraculously preserved liquid, but only when his beatification and canonization would take place, they would have first-class relics for it. The surprise was when the beatification came and Cardinal Givish opened the little trunk with the blood in it that was in the sister's chapel to see that the blood was completely liquefied, because they thought they were seeing a miracle in the blood itself, the Lord allowing us to see that John Paul was alive because the blood was preserved liquefied. But the first miracle for me, so many years after his death, to see that the relic was coming and how the secular means of communication were announcing it. Third apostolic visit of John Paul II, fourth visit, based on how many previous visits he'd done in life. What moved the secular means of communication to call it an apostolic visit, as if the person was totally present? How do we prepare for it? First of all, studying what he had said, what John Paul II had said in that country, to remind the people of that country, listen to what John Paul said in his different voyages. They're like a map to be able to analyze the designs of God for their own nation. It was not only the veneration, but we were always reminding people of his legacy to the nation and to the church. If we go to the Temple of the Holy Family, Church of the Holy Family, then we remind them of the legacy John Paul left about the family, about the rosary. We always intersperse prayer with formation so that people may remember the legacy of John Paul. I think that St. John Paul II will continue to do great miracles, but he'll do them in an integrated way. There's so many physical miracles, yes. It's impossible to tell them all. But family miracles, I would like to tell you, on all levels of family difficulties, we have seen conversions from addictions, conversions of families who are on the point of separating, addictions, kidnappings, miracles. I'll also tell one about these. For me, the personalism of St. John Paul II, his entire legacy, continues to be manifested in the kind of miracles that he gives. That detail of looking at each person, the details that each person needs that we don't know, but we start to realize after they tell us, how he could see all the details that the person needed. That was the way that the miracle came to be realized. It wasn't just the miracle in itself, but the details surrounding the miracle. Sometimes we would stop in a house because sometimes we couldn't pass through, and in the house where we stopped, someone in the house would just start to cry and fall to their knees, and we would realize afterwards that was the person that was in charge of cooking for him when he went to whatever country in whatever year. So many details that people experienced, that he's looking at me. It doesn't matter if I'm in the midst of millions of people, he's looking at me. And myself and all of the sisters and lay people that go with us, we can testify that John Paul keeps looking at you. That so many people had a detail with him. It was almost like he was saying thank you through the relic. We've seen promises fulfilled. That's what happened in one country when we always have, during the veneration, many different masses. And I remember in one of the masses in Central America, the Vicar General, first it was the bishop, and then it was the Vicar General. When he celebrated the Holy Mass, he couldn't. He was crying and crying and crying. He couldn't even start Mass. It was the longest Mass because he was crying and crying. And when he went up to proclaim the gospel and give his homily, and I felt this so strongly because for John Paul, we are his daughters. He said, I'm crying so much because John Paul is fulfilling his promise today. And we didn't know everything that was happening. He said, I was studying in Rome, and I went to a mass of all the Salvadorian priests, and he had only been to Salvador a few months before. And I said, when will you come back to my country? And he looked directly into my eyes, and he said, yes, I'm going to return, but I'm going to return after my death. He was giving a promise, a prophetic promise. And he said, he is returned to our country, but now in his relic of blood. He's fulfilling his promise. Miracles. Miracles. What can I tell you? The theme of John Paul was always the dignity of the human person. And all the miracles touch all the dimensions of the human person. For example, we see that the love he had for the defense of the unborn, the defense of the dignity of the human person. I can't even tell you about the millions, thousands of John Pauls that exist today in America, thanks to the miracles of conception, where there had been a medical proclamation of permanent sterility. One, for example, that I can tell you about a little John Paul and a little Juana Paula. Miraculous conceptions. And I say miraculous because medically it had been determined that these people couldn't conceive children. We were in a church, and there were so many young couples there, and it was full. This is what I want to say to you, multitudes. We're speaking that sometimes our missions would last 18 hours, standing, ministering, because it's not just only to put the relic out. It's helping people to put all their religious articles so that they may be touched by the relic, so they may be second-class relics, helping the sick to touch the relic. And what happens? For example, this married couple is in line, and the lines are long, sometimes 15 hours long, and it doesn't matter to the people to wait. And one of the sisters drew near to this married couple and invited them to come to the front. When they got to the front, we always asked the people, what do you want us to pray for with you? And they said, please pray that we can conceive a child. And we started to pray for this intention. John Paul, you're the Pope of the family. You wanted to be remembered as the Pope of the family. Grant that our Lord may give them the miracle of this baby, and that she may be able to sustain the baby in her womb. So when the people tell us this story, they say, I'm leaving the hospital. I just lost my third child. I wasn't able to sustain the baby more than 2 months in my womb. And the doctors told me it was impossible. And a nurse told me that Relic was here, so I came here. But I was with the worry that I would be too weak. I wouldn't be able to stand being in line. But all of a sudden, a sister comes to tell me to come out of line and to come with my husband to the front to ask John Paul for this miracle. A year later, on the feast of St. John Paul II, which we always celebrate greatly, that year we were dedicating it to the family. And so when we asked, does anybody have a testimony? And what is our joy that in the middle of the aisle, this couple comes forward with a baby in their arms. And we always put handkerchiefs and holy cards on the relic, and we give it to the people, and we say, keep praying and place this on your womb, and ask John Paul for this miracle. So John Paul gained this miracle for her, and they said, we're going to baptize him with the name of John Paul. Like I told you, miraculous conceptions, families being united. Well, the time it's not enough, right? But there's a story of a kidnapping. For me, this was so impressing. We're in a country of Latin America. It was the first day of veneration. There was lines at least of 18 hours. And they announced that there was a young man that they have kidnapped, and that in this country, the majority of kidnappings end in death. We started to pray because they wanted us to pray, please. And so we were asking all the multitudes that were there to pray that John Paul would intercede so that this young man would be freed. And the whole time, I was remembering how our Lord and Our Lady protected John Paul in his youth from so many dangers. And so we were asking this intention in each Mass that he would appear, and he would appear well. So we spent many days, and we didn't know anything, nothing about this young man. We went to another diocese, and we kept interceding for him. And on the 6th day, we were in the middle of veneration with thousands of people, and a lady came screaming, "Miracle, miracle! He appeared, he appeared." Well, that was the miracle. But the details of the miracle were not only for this young man. It turns out that the young man appeared. He knocked at the door of his home. His mother opened. She saw him. She hugs him. And he says, "Mom, this is a miracle of John Paul II." And he didn't know that everyone was praying to John Paul II for this miracle. What happened? In the first day, a kidnapper came, that each time he was going to torture him, he said, no, I'll wait till tomorrow. each time he wanted to torture him. He would say, I'll wait till tomorrow. So it turns out that this kidnapper got sick. And so a second kidnapper came. But the mother of this kidnapper was very sick and also very devoted to John Paul. And she told her son, please take me to the church where the blood of St. John Paul is, because I want to ask him for my health. And the kidnapper, that nobody knew he was a kidnapper, took her in her wheelchair. So the young man himself said that one of the sisters said, please come to the front because we always want those who are the sick to be the priority. They said this to the kidnapper and his mother. And so she came up and she embraced the relic, and he started to feel in his heart an ardor and a remorse, a profound remorse, because here was his mother, sick, being embraced by the love of St. John Paul II, and he was causing, and he was going to cause damage to a mother. And this is where his conversion, the conversion of the kidnapper, began. So when he was supposed to kill the young man, they say that, though the young man tells that how immediately they gave him bread, water, what they hadn't given him before, and they began to treat him better, and at a certain moment, he said, look, I can't do this. I'm going to help you to escape. And he told the story of how he took his mother to the Relic, and that he couldn't do this to him because he could not cause pain to a mother. And he himself, running the risk, we don't know that what happened with this kidnapper. He took him to a hidden way and to give him back to his mom. Miracles. What can I tell you? The reunion of a grandmother with her grandson on the first pilgrimage, on the first night, there were 10,000 people in a church, and I said, we're going to spend 24 hours here, we're not going to leave the church. And so a woman came. She wasn't elderly, but she was pretty older, and she was crying and crying, and we said, what do you want us to pray for? Please, Mother, help me to pray to John Paul so that I can see my grandson again. It's been 30 years. My son separated from his wife, and they took him, and we haven't known anything more of him. So we started to pray to the Pope of the family that he would bring them back together so she could see her grandson again. She wouldn't die without seeing him. So after we were praying, there were thousands of people behind. I said, stay here a while, look for a seat, and pray the rosary for this intention, and ask John Paul that he may bring your grandson back. So she stayed there amongst the multitude in a little corner on her knees. And all of a sudden, on the third mystery, a young person comes in, about 35 years old, and he kneels in the pew right in front of her. So she said that when this young person came in, her heart started to beat strongly, and she didn't know what was happening. She didn't know what it was. So she just said her grandson's name out loud, and the man turned around and said, are you calling me? And then at that moment, she said, what is your name? And when he said his name, she knew it was her grandson. She says, I was here praying to John Paul that he would bring us back together. And he says, well, this is truly a miracle, because all my life I wanted to know my grandma, and I never would have imagined that I would be able to do it. He said, I don't live here. I'm just passing through. My flight was delayed. And I said, well, I'm going to go try to see the relic of St. John Paul II. That was on the news in all of Miami. And that's why I came. Look, do we realize all the details that were arranged? The hand of Our Lady, through the intercession of John Paul, that this reunification would happen. Like at the hour that I saw this lady enter the pew with this young man, and they were both crying and before the relic, kneeling and saying, thank you, John Paul, for bringing us together. I realized what had happened. I left the relic, I went up to them, and I recorded the miracle. Monsignor Oder has boxes and boxes of all the miracles. Miracles, physical miracles, so many. That happened immediately. Others, we realized afterwards. One of those that most impressed me was in a hospital. we took the relic to hospitals, prisons, everywhere. And we went to a hospital and we placed the relic in the chapel. First, for the doctors, nurses, all the medical personnel. Before journeying with the relic on a stretcher through all the floors of the hospital. And the reason that we did this, I spoke to them and I said, John Paul had a very high esteem for doctors. He honored you. He loved your profession so that you may have time. And imagine the doctors looking at this blood. The first thing was the scientific gaze. The blood. And they were moving it. And I said, move it. Do whatever you want to be convinced that John Paul's alive. So here all the doctors passed. After they were convinced that they were before a miracle, they started to ask. And then all of a sudden a doctor comes that worked in this hospital, and he started to cry. And he said to John Paul, save my son, save my son. And he said to us, my child is in his last hours. He's 9 years old. He has cancer, brain cancer. He's full of tumors. He's been in a coma for a month, and he just has hours left. He could barely breathe. So we all started to ask John Paul, and we put a holy card and a handkerchief on the relic, and I said, run to his room and put this handkerchief and his holy card on his head, and that's what he did. We continued ministering to all those who were coming, when all of a sudden the doctor comes at 1:30, crying, screaming, miracle, miracle, miracle. When we asked him what happened, he said, I did what you asked. I went and I put the handkerchief and the holy card touched to the relic. I asked St. John Paul II for this miracle, and all of a sudden, I put myself with my hands over my head crying, and I felt the hand of my son on my head. It started to move. All of a sudden, he opened his eyes. All of a sudden, he spoke with perfect coordination, and he told me, Dad, what's going on? Why am I here? Why are you crying? He asked to eat, so much so that he, being a doctor, took him to the oncologist, and they did an MRI for the result but there was no trace of any tumor, not a trace of any brain lesion. I don't know how much time I have. Someone please let me know. But to give you the last thing, because the last one speaks about the means of communication. That's why I'm so happy that we're doing this on Zoom. It was in a city in Argentina, and the church was full. And a married couple comes forward that you could tell wasn't from that town. And they come forward, they come close, and they say that we're only here for a business meeting, but we need to pray before the relic. So one of our lay people that was with us helping, because we're always attentive to those who are sick, those are people of need, and so they brought them forward and said, can we bring them forward? And they said, please help us to pray for a boy who was hit by a car 3 months ago in Buenos Aires. And I said, do you have a picture of the boy? And he said, only on my phone. So I said, doesn't matter, put it on the relic with the picture of the child. And so we all started to pray over the cell phone on the relic. And I said, now take a picture of the blood of John Paul. That little plastic casing that covers it, and send it to the boy's parents so that they can place that picture of the blood on the child's head. So turns out that they do that, and the next day was the last day of veneration in that city, and at 6 in the morning, that family was back to give thanks, crying. They did the same thing. They sent the picture, and when this family in Buenos Aires put the picture of the blood of John Paul on their son's head, and they started to pray, the boy opened his eyes, they did an MRI. Supposedly, his whole brain was lesioned because the hit was onto his head. The boy had no traces of any lesion, and 2 days later, he was able to go back to school in 3 months, and he was totally healed. At all levels, we can say that John Paul's miracles touch the family, they touch hearts, they touch the prisoners, the sick, physical healings. If someone had to be canonized 25,000 times, John Paul would be that way. But not only the body, the soul, family realities, work realities, all the realities of the human person, poverty, how many things we saw in the poorest places. That is the same thing that he would do when he went on his apostolic visitations. We continue to see through the pilgrimages of his relics. Thank you so much, brother. The truth is that we could be here hours. We could be here 12 hours speaking about these experiences, but we're going to respond also to some questions. Now I'm going to ask a priest that has written here that he owes his vocation to John Paul. He'll tell us in a minute. But I also wanted to respond to one of the questions that have come in the chat. That says, if you know that on the part of Benedict XVI, he received the petition of the Church of Santo Subito and accelerated the process of canonization of John Paul. Mother said yes. Antonio says, I think that the Vatican's response also, and I think that one of the missions of the Vatican is to work with much seriousness. And I think that sometimes it's not good to allow oneself to be taken only by the fame of sanctity, but to try to do everything in the most professional way possible, because I think that you have to take into account that the Church is an institution and the Vatican works speaking in centuries, and we can't think that, well, Santo Subito, be a saint right away. It's an expression of the street, but we have to also be very careful that we're playing with something very important, and I think that all these processes must be respected, and that experience tells us that we have seen phenomena in the Church, some of them lamentable, others of people who seemed ideal, but later it's discovered that they were not good. And we have also seen cases of people that many people admired. So it takes a lot of precaution, a lot of care, and a lot of time. And sometimes the times of the Church seem eternal. And some people say, why doesn't the Vatican say something about this? Well, careful. They take their time, and I think that it's good. And so I also wanted to say to Juan Carlos Velarde, who is coming with us from Santander, Spain, that he received and he owes his vocation to John Paul, Juan Carlos. And he says, I'm so happy to share with you, with my testimony very briefly. Since I was 12, I felt the call of Jesus to be a priest. And being an only child, well, I was having a hard time deciding whether to move forward or not. So I entered the seminary at 19, and I remembered that before the great doubt of whether or not I should continue forward, we received the visit of St. John Paul II to Spain, and all the seminarians gathered together in the Seminary of Madrid, in San Damaso. And the thing is, I don't know what he said, but what I assure all those listening to me is that I turned around, behind me was Cardinal Carlos Osorro, then he was my rector, and I said, Don Carlos, I have no doubt, I'm going to be a priest. Therefore, Mother Adela, another miracle is me. I'm a poor priest, but I consider myself a miracle of John Paul II. And a second thing was I asked to be able to serve the Church in the means of communication, in concretely Radio Vatican Radio, and well, I've been here 16 years. Therefore, the second miracle of St. John Paul II. Thank you. I have loved listening to you, and the very, very last thing, my best friends wasn't able to become pregnant. After 2 months, they would lose the baby. I entrusted them to St. John Paul II, and little Rodrigo is already 7 months old. And so there's another Juan Pablito. I would like to comment on something, if you'd allow me, and that the miracle of a vocation, so much of young men and women, that when the relic passed by, they felt the call, whether the priestly vocation or male or female religious life. And we would always try to give them, all those people that experienced the call, to have some time before Him to mature the grace that they received when passing before the relic. And vocations are another one of the miracles of the relic. I would also like to respond to the question about the promptitude or the slowness of the Vatican. We saw with St. John Paul II both things. Let's remember that John Paul had lifted the 5 years required to wait to open the cause, the diocesan cause, for any person for whom they wanted to open the cause of beatification. John Paul had pushed it forward with Mother Teresa. He made an exception that she didn't have to wait the 5 years to begin her cause. So with people that have a universal fame of sanctity, proved by much, by their life, by its fruits, not by their works, by the fruits of their holiness, that they could move forward the cause. So Pope Benedict XVI, the process of the study of beatification for St. John Paul II for his canonization was so super rigid. And I'm a witness because I'm a personal friend of Monsignor Oder. Super rigid. But Benedict XVI, yes, he lifted the waiting of the 5 years. He did the same thing that John Paul did with Mother Teresa. So that process, as much diocesan and Roman, as we can say, from the Diocese of Rome, they were so strict, above all, because he was a pope, and with such a luminous and extensive magisterium, his life, his person, the holiness of his whole life, studying his writings. It was such a long and hard process to study his miracles. But yes, Pope Benedict XVI exempted him from waiting those 5 years. Yes, there was a response to the Santo Subito that I was in the funeral, and the Santo Subito was not the cry of a few, it was the cry of the millions. And even the heads of state. Let's remember that it was a funeral where all the heads of state had been present, and all of them had to do a gesture of inclining themselves when his casket was placed on the floor, and when the Book of the Gospels was blowing with the wind, seemed like of the Holy Spirit. So it was a unanimous cry of Santo Subito. And from the cardinals, and from the bishops, and from the priests, religious, it was the entire church. But also the heads of state crying Santo Subito. Pope Benedict XVI responded to the sense of the faithful, exempting him from the 5 years of waiting. But later, he was so strict in the study, the detailed study of every word, every work, every action. So we have both realities in Mother Church, acting in the case of St. John Paul II. So, very good. Before continuing, if you also have another question, you can set it in the chat. But I wanted to greet Javier. As you see, he's in Guadalupe, in Mexico, and he is responsible for the communication of the Agustinos, Recolectos, and he is a person that I'm sure has something to tell us about St. John Paul II. Well, good afternoon there, good morning here. I'm speaking to you from a parish that's going to sound familiar to you. It's the parish of Mother of God of Czestochowa here in Mexico City, in Lomas de Tecamachan. I'm a recollected Augustinian, as Antonio said, and I would like to highlight a question about St. John Paul II from the times that he came to Mexico and how he loved Mexico so much. He visited this country in 1979, and he visited a hospital, the Children's Hospital of Mexico. It's a very big hospital. Now it has people who are sick from COVID-19 in that hospital too. This hospital Up until this moment, it's had various remodelings. They had a greater construction in another building. I was there for 13 years as a chaplain, and one of the things that they have respected, that the public health system here is totally lay, but within that old building, the Mundet building, is the chapel. It's a small, simple chapel, and there's an image of St. John Paul II that they have respected just as it is. That entire building is remodeled. There were earthquakes in 1985 that affected the foundations, but they have respected the chapel where St. John Paul II was in 1979. And another thing that I wanted to highlight, and with this I will finish, about the visits that St. John Paul II made, is the recognition that in 1992 he came to Merida, and there he recognized the Catholic Church as a church with all of its juridical rights. Before example, the priests that from the Cristero Wars, that they couldn't wear their priestly vestments in the street, or religious couldn't go out with their habits. And from that moment on, there was a relationship between the Holy See and Mexico, and it's because when St. John Paul II came to make this relationship happen. Well, all of the memories, anecdotes of people, I remember that in the last visit, Javier Martinez was reporting in the year 2000 and something, and with the beatification of the famous martyrs of Oaxaca, well, nothing else. It's been a pleasure to, as always, to be with you and to share how much in love with Our Lady of Guadalupe he was. And Mother says, here he is with Our Lady of Guadalupe. And truly, something that he would like us to note, something that we have of traveling as part of our evangelization mission of our community, both feminine and masculine, is with the pilgrimages of John Paul, of the relic of his blood. We don't stop. If we stop 2 days and we continue on to another country, something that has always called our attention is the airports. In all the airports where he passed through, there is generally a chapel, and in all of these chapels there's a plaque or a relic that says, here, St. John Paul II prayed here. That is, you see the impact of the person, the heart. I won't say the magisterium, but we're speaking about the impact of St. John Paul II on the heart of people wherever he went. On a little plaque in an airport, we were there with the relic, and you've always seen in our videos the miracle of the venerations on planes. And you can know that you can never stop a plane, but we would come boarding the plane with the relic. We made it more worthy with the papal shield, and they would always ask us, what are you bringing? And we'd say, it's the relic of St. John Paul II. And immediately there was a commotion among the stewards and stewardesses, and they would tell the captain. Well, the captain would come on and announce, we have with us here a passenger, the most important passenger we could have. It's the relic of St. John Paul II, and John Paul II had to come and search for people like us. And we said, well, if you would like to venerate the relic, here we are ready. And so we would open up the relic on the airplane for people with lines. And they would bring us up to first class where there was more space, and people would be passing throughout the whole flight. And if we didn't finish, we'd stay on the exit room or entrance room, waiting so that all the people could venerate. So we have seen amongst peoples on the highways, when we see in places, very, very poor places that we'd pass through, and poor people coming out maybe from within the mountains, because they know that the car is going to pass by that's bearing the relic. When I see all these people, these poor people, sometimes with their priest, waiting just to see it pass by, I would always have to stop the car, and it didn't matter to me. St. John Paul II had to bless those people. And so we'd give the relic to the prays to that people so he could bless his people. So we could spend hours to tell you that John Paul is alive and that people continue to feel him alive, close to them. And the people want him close to them. They cry and they say, don't leave me, protect me, care for me. They have that love. They have the love for him as their father. And that's just simply to remind that the images in the documentary that we're preparing, there's going to be images from those multitudes. And also, in your order, there's a website so that anyone interested that has any question can refer to it. It's called Corazones.org, where there's videos with images of the pilgrimages that they've done with the relic. Adriana, Mother Adela, thank you so much for everything. I'm Adriana from Rome Reports. Thank you, Adriana, Mother says. Well, I would like to comment that of everything that you've told, it's so much more special because today is the World Day of Families. So imagine, it's even more special on a day like today. It's him, Mother says. Thank you. I would like to take advantage that we could just spend a minute and answer some questions. You could turn on your microphone and ask questions either to Mother or Antonio because we're a little over time. I just wanted to say something that I'm so profoundly grateful for this opportunity because today we were starting the International Congress in Thanksgiving for the centenary of the birth of St. John Paul II. Because of the pandemic, we weren't able to do it now, but we're going to do it in November. But we are doing much in this weekend to honor the life of this great ray of light that the Holy Spirit and the Immaculate Heart of Mary gave us, the Blessed Virgin Mary gave us, not only for the 20th century and 21st century, but for until the end of time. A new question, they say. Yes, of course, ask. Mother Adela, she knows so much about the apostolic visitations of John Paul II did in Latin America. And one of the important visits of St. John Paul II was his visit to El Salvador in 1983. And we know very well that here in San Salvador, in the capital, there's a street that is called John Paul II Avenue, because that's where he passed through. But in that occasion, he got off the route that was established in order to establish the Metropolitan Cathedral, including even the fact that it wasn't on the agenda of the cathedral, and the cathedral was closed, and the Pope had to wait so they could open it for him, so he could visit the tomb of now, who is Saint Oscar Romero. But Mother Adela, I don't know if you know, or if someone knows Antonio, what passed through the mind and heart of St. John Paul II to go to the tomb of Oscar Romero? Well, we have to remember that entire moment in history was very difficult for all of Central America. I'm Nicaraguan, and I have to say, I remember when the communists took possession of my country, and they were trying to take possession of all of the countries of Central America, particularly El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. So St. John Paul II had a particularity not only with America, he had a particularity of visiting the countries in their most difficult moments of their history. He's a man of history, and all of his way of reading it was how to bring the power and grace of Christ and the power of the Immaculate Heart to the roots of the problems of contemporary history. That's why his consecrations always spoke about the contemporary problems. Well, El Salvador was in a moment of great crisis. The situation was very grave. Monsignor Romero had already been assassinated. It was a very difficult and confusing situation, because on one side, he was a person that was supporting the left, and so the leftists were using him as their flag. It wasn't very clear what the position was, but for John Paul II, while he was studying what was truly his position, when his homilies, writings were truly being studied, it was taking a long time. Before all, he was a bishop that had been assassinated. He was one of his sons that had been assassinated. And this is what moved him in 1983 to go to visit his tomb. When he learned about the assassination of Bishop Romero, he cried profoundly, just as he would do for any bishop assassinated in a social crisis, such as he was. And he was a martyr because he died persecuted and celebrating the Holy Eucharist at the moment that he elevated the chalice. That's when the bullet pierced his heart. What was he looking at above all? John Paul II wasn't seeing if he was left or right, if he was in the middle. That was going to be studied. That would be profoundly analyzed. What John Paul II was seeing was, this is my son. He is my brother who has been assassinated during the Mass. And I need to go and give him honor, give honor to this martyr who died giving his life for his people. That reality is untouchable. He died, assassinated. He was a martyr for his people. Now, to study the other dimensions would take the church time to truly be able to recognize the adequate place and the true story and the true physiognomy of Bishop Romero. And well, it's already been proved of who Bishop Romero was, because if not, Pope Francis wouldn't have canonized him. It was something very historical in his 2 visits that he made. And I would also like to remind everyone of the words that he left to us Salvadorians, but also to everyone, that may we be artisans of peace. Exactly. I think that, as you say, Pope Francis already canonized him. But look how much time has passed until he could canonize him, because there was a strict study of so many ideologies that were being confronted. There were also the realities of the using of a person for agendas on one side or another. Well, the church has to take a lot more time to be able to study and come to a conclusion, authentic conclusion of the physiognomy, the ideology, way of thought, and way of acting of a person. But in that visit, he was visiting his brother, Bishop, his son, that had been assassinated. And then after, the church, and it was up to Pope Francis to conclude the process of the study of the life, person, and thought of Monsignor Romero. Thank you very much, Mother Adela, for being with us today. We'd like to thank the 80 people that were connected, that have been here listening to her. We'd also like to thank all the anecdotes that you have told us, and for those that are here, you already know what we're going to do. So, thank you very much, Mother Adela, for your testimony. They have been very beautiful. All of the commentaries have touched our hearts. Well, thank you. Let's remember this. St. John Paul II is alive, and he is alive in the heart of the church and of the world, and we're going to continue seeing him act. Let's not be afraid of asking him. Ask him for whatever you want, because he continues looking at each one of us personally, and he continues being in fullness now from heaven, the same he was on earth, fully. And he doesn't forget about any of us. On the contrary. Thank you very much, because now we have the title of the documentary clear, and it's going to be a success, and we will announce it in upcoming weeks. Thank you, everyone, for being with us, and we'll see you soon. May God bless you. Thank you. Thank you, he says.